Hey, what's up guys? Brian Kelly here from Zombie Guitar. Here in this video I want to talk about what I call the great modes debate. So the modes thing, this big debate, everyone's always arguing about modes. This is what modes are. No, this is modes. No, this is modes. This is a guitar community thing. You're only really going to find this much debate, this much arguing going on about this concept in the guitar community. And the weird thing is that modes really aren't even that important. They're not. I have a friend that's one of the greatest musicians I've ever met in person, the keyboard player of my old band. The guy's a jazz monster, a blues monster. He's an everything monster. He can play any song by ear in a matter of minutes. He knows theory better than anyone I've ever met before. I've asked him his opinion about modes before. I've discussed with him. I asked him if he ever uses them. He's like, "Oh yeah, I know about modes. Whatever. I don't care about them." He doesn't care. They're not important. They're really not. They have their place, but they're far from as important as people make them out to be. This is a guitar community thing. Only in the guitar community do people care this much about this modes thing. All right, so with that said, this video is also not about teaching you modes in depth. I have a 3-part series that I made about that, which I will put a link to below. 3-part series talks about relative modes, parallel modes, and modal chord progressions. I'm not going to get into all that stuff in this video. Check out those links. This video, the purpose of this is to give you the 3 different perspectives that people have regarding this concept, which is known as modes. The first perspective that people have is they think they're patterns on the fretboard. So if you're soloing here, you're playing in a mode. If you jump up to here, you're playing in a different mode. If you jump down to here, you're playing in a different mode. That's the one perspective people have. The second perspective is modes are something that you do on a per chord basis. So if you're soloing over, a 3-chord chord progression, you may play one mode over the first chord, another mode over the second chord, another mode over the third chord. That's the second perspective. The third perspective, which is the one I subscribe to, is modes are equivalent to keys. So you can write a song that's in a major key, otherwise known as the Ionian mode. You can write a sad song in a minor key, that would be known as the Aeolian mode. You can write another song in the Dorian mode. That wouldn't sound like the major key song, it wouldn't sound like the minor key song, it would have its own unique sound known as the Dorian sound. So those are the 3 different perspectives that people have regarding modes. Let's look at each one of these in detail now. So the first perspective that people have regarding modes is that they are patterns on the fretboard. So the way that they come up with this perception is because, if you take pattern 1 plus pattern 2 plus pattern 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, essentially they're saying that there's 7 different patterns of the scale, and each of those patterns is a mode. So if you're trying to solo over a chord progression that's in, say, the key of C major, let's say our chords are C major to A minor to F major to G major. That's the chord progression. All those chords are part of the key of C major. Someone's looking to learn how to solo over the entire fretboard. They might want to use this pattern here. They might want to use this pattern here. They might want to use this pattern here. Whatever. You can keep moving up the fretboard and playing these different patterns. But these patterns are all the same notes. So that's the whole thing. That's where the confusion comes in. This pattern here contains the same 7 notes as this pattern, as this pattern, as this pattern. Each of these patterns contain the same 7 notes. What are those 7 notes? Those 7 notes are the notes of the C major scale. Why are we using that scale? Because the chord progression is in the key of C major. How do we know that those chords are all in the key of C major? You look at your circle of fifths, you look at the grouping of 6 around the C major chord, and you can see your surrounding chords. These are the 3 major and 3 minor chords that are part of the key of C major. If you're trying to solo over a chord progression that uses just those chords, you use your C major scale over the entire chord progression. That's the scale to use. So the C major scale can be found forming a pattern here. It can be found forming a pattern here, 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 whatever, all the way up the fretboard. So then people may say, well, this pattern starts on the note F. That can't be the C major scale. Well, no one's ever said that you had to start on the note F as you're improvising. You have the whole fretboard. The whole fretboard is yours for the taking. You're improvising over this progression. If you want to come down here, you can play this pattern in any order you want. If you want to jump up to here, you can play in that pattern in any order you want. You can start on the note C. You can start on the note A. You can start on the note B. It doesn't matter. Just as long as you're playing the 7 notes that are part of the C major scale, it doesn't matter which pattern you use. All right, so someone may say, okay, well, this is the F Lydian mode. All right, so if I'm playing this pattern and it's the F Lydian mode, what if I decide to start halfway up, halfway through this pattern? So instead of starting on the F here, what if I decide to start here? I'm starting on the note C, but I'm still playing in this pattern. Am I not playing that mode anymore? I'm still in that pattern. I'm just not starting on the first note of the pattern. You see what I'm saying here? So this is kind of ridiculous. It's ridiculous to say that modes are patterns. Mode 1, mode 2, mode 3. These are not modes. You're just playing the 7 notes from the C major scale over the chord progression that is in the key of C major. Why don't piano players have this problem? Because on a piano, if they're playing the key of C major, it's just white keys. All the notes from the C major scale are the white keys. None of the black keys are in the key of C major. So you just run up and down the piano using just the white keys. It doesn't matter what note you start on. It doesn't matter what order you play the notes in. You just improvise in the key of C major. So, modes are not patterns on the fretboard. So just as a quick demonstration, let me just kind of show you. I'm going to noodle over that chord progression that I told you, the C major, A minor, F major, G major chord progression. And I'm going to just noodle around in various different patterns, starting on various different strings. And I'm going to, circle within the fretboard diagram of the C major scale exactly which pattern I'm using. And you're going to see that every pattern pretty much sounds the same. It's just the C major sound. It's the C major scale that I'm using as my improvisational framework. Everything is just part of the C major scale. So the second perspective is what I like to call the jazz approach. The reason I call it the jazz approach is because people think that if there's a chord progression happening, say there's a 3-chord chord progression, that you need to play one mode over this chord, and then a different mode over the second chord, and then a different mode over the third chord. So the reason I call this the jazz approach is because in jazz players are used to playing one scale per chord. The reason they do that is because things aren't always going to be clearly in just one key. So if you're soloing or if you're attempting to improvise over a jazz progression, it's not always going to be so cut and dry like that's the key of C major, or that's the key of F major, or that's the key of A minor or something. Jazz progressions are usually pretty complicated. There's going to be all kinds of out-of-key chords. There's going to be all kinds of extended chords that use out-of-key notes. There's going to be key modulations. There's not just going to always be one super easy tonal center like we looked at in the last example. So jazz players, they become accustomed to playing one scale for each chord. I play this scale over this chord, then once the next chord happens, I switch my scale to this scale. So that's the jazz approach. So do you need to take the jazz approach when you're playing over a chord progression in which all of the chords are part of the same key? You can, but it's not always necessary. So let me just give you an example here. So let's take a 2-5-1 progression in the key of C major. So your 2 chord is going to be a D minor 7 chord. Your 5 chord is going to be a G dominant 7 chord. And then the 1 chord is going to be a C major 7 chord. So all 3 of those chords are part of the key of C major. The notes that make up the D minor 7 chord are D, F, A, and C. The notes that make up the G dominant 7 chord are G, B, D, and F. The notes that make up the C major 7 chord are C, E, G, and B. So all of the notes that make up all of these chords are all part of the key of C major. Therefore, this progression is 100% diatonic to the key of C major. So if I wanted to, I could just take the same approach that I did in part 1 and use the C major scale over each chord. And then what to do on a per chord basis would be to focus on the actual notes of each chord. So even though I'm using the C major scale as my main scale, certain notes are going to sound better over each chord on a per chord basis. Those are known as the chord tones. So no matter what style of music you're playing, there's always going to be that 2-layer approach. There's always going to be the scale, and then there's going to be the chord tones of the chord. So if you're playing over a chord progression in which everything's in the same key, the scale is just the one scale. It's the key scale. But then what to do on a per chord basis, it's going to be to target the chord tones of each individual chord. The same 2-layer approach applies to complicated jazz progressions too. You still have the scale, even if it's going to be a different scale for each chord, and then you focus on the chord tones within the scale. So the scale is just like the surrounding notes, and the chord tones are the strong notes. All right, so even if you're playing over complicated chord progressions that aren't all in the same key, the 2-layer approach still applies. So let's go back to this 2-5-1 progression again. So as a jazz player, I may be accustomed to playing one scale per chord. So I may find it beneficial to think that the scale to play over the D minor 7 chord would be the D Dorian. All right, so the D Dorian is the same notes as the C major scale. So D Dorian is D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. The C major scale is C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. So if I want to call this D Dorian, that's fine. If I want to call this C major, that's fine. It's the same scale. I can play those notes in any order. The best sounding notes in the scale are still going to be the D, F, A, and C, because those are the chord tones of that particular chord. Jazz players may find it beneficial to refer to the scale of that particular chord as D Dorian as opposed to C Ionian or C major, simply because it's a D chord, therefore in their mind it may make more sense, to play a D type of scale over it. So really the only difference is the thought approach, so if I want to think that I'm playing the D Dorian scale while focusing on the chord tones of the D minor 7, I can do that. Or if I want to think that I'm playing the C major scale while focusing on the chord tones of the D minor 7, I could do that. Either way, the results are going to be 100% identical. It doesn't matter what I think, because the notes that are being produced are going to be exactly the same. I'm still using the exact same scale over that chord. All right. When I move to the G dominant 7 chord, a jazz player may think, okay, I want to play G mixolydian over that chord. Or someone that is just used to thinking in terms of just the one scale, the overall key scale, they may want to say, oh, I'm still in the key of C major here, so I'm still using the C major scale. The C major scale is C, D, E, F, G, A, and B. The G mixolydian scale would be G, A, B, C, D, E, and F. It's the same notes. It doesn't matter. Jazz players may find it beneficial to think in terms of a G type of scale over a G type of chord, but at the end of the day, the same music is being produced, the same results are happening. So that would be why a jazz player may think like that, but that brings up the question, why should I call that a mode? Should I say that this is a mode, that's the D Dorian mode, and then I switch to the G, the G mixolydian mode, and then when it gets to the C major 7th, then I'm switching to the C Ionian mode. So why not just call them scales? If I'm playing one scale per chord while focusing on the chord tones of each chord, doesn't it make more sense to just call them scales and just throw that word modes in the trash? Really, what's the point of confusion? So that's really where I'm getting at. So is that approach incorrect? No, not necessarily. You're still doing the same thing that a person that is thinking in terms of just one overall key would be doing. The jazz player is just thinking, okay, D Dorian scale, G Mixolydian scale, C Ionian scale, focus on the chord tones. The person that's thinking in terms of key signatures are thinking, okay, I'm just playing C major the whole time, focusing on chord tones of each individual chord. But why use the term mode? That's what I'm getting at. That's why this approach really isn't modes, in my opinion. All right. So let's talk about point 3, what modes actually are. So the third perspective, and this is the one that I subscribe to, is that modes are sounds. They're the same as keys, essentially. If you write a song that's in a major key, it's going to have a specific sound. If you write a song that's in a minor key, it's going to have a specific sound. The major key song is going to sound happy and cheery and bright. The minor key song is going to sound dark, sad, bluesy, whatever, however you want to describe it. But it's going to be two distinctly different sounds. So another word for a major key is going to be the Ionian mode. Another word for the minor key is the Aeolian mode. So the way that this stuff works is in any given key signature, there's 12 possible key signatures, each of which is on the circle of fifths. You can use the grouping of 6 to determine the 6 in-key chords, or the 3 major and 3 minor chords that are part of any given key signature. So remaining in the key signature of C major, these are going to be your 3 major chords and 3 minor chords that are part of this key signature. So if you write a chord progression and you base it around the C major chord, you make the C major chord to be your tonal center, then everything is going to have a specific sound. It's going to have that Ionian sound. You can do the same thing with the A minor chord, write a chord progression, make the A minor chord your tonal center. The music that's produced is going to be the Aeolian sound. So you can do the same thing with the other chords that are found in this grouping of 6. If you base your chord progression around the D minor chord and you make the D minor chord to be your tonal center and use these chords that are part of this grouping of 6, but make it so your D minor chord is your tonal center, the sound that is produced is going to be the Dorian sound. If you make the E minor chord your tonal center, it's going to be the Phrygian sound. If you make the F chord to be your tonal center, Lydian sound. If you make the G major chord to be your tonal center, Mixolydian sound. So one thing to point out, and that is that the more chords that you use in your progression, even if you're writing your song or progression just using these 6 chords that you see here in this grouping of 6, the more chords that you use, the less likely it is to be modal. And when I say modal, I'm talking about stuff other than Ionian or Aeolian, otherwise known as major keys or minor keys. So when you use, say you're writing a chord progression that has like 4 or 5 chords in it, it's going to have a very strong tendency to sound as if the tonal center is going to be either the C major chord or the A minor chord. It's going to be hard to force one of the other chords to be the tonal center. That's just kind of the nature of modes, or possibly it might just be due to the fact that in Western music, which is what I'm accustomed to listening to mostly, most of the stuff I hear is in major keys and minor keys, so my ears just aren't quite as accustomed to hearing, Dorian music or Lydian music or Phrygian music. But that's not to say that it can't be done. Alright, so now I'm just going to play 6 demos for you. So for each of these demos, I'm only going to use these 6 chords that you see here in this grouping of 6, and I'm only going to use the 7 notes that are found within the C major scale, the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, and B, and I'm only going to do it in just this one pattern here. So I'm only going to be here within the 4th and the 8th frets. I'm only going to play right here just to show you that these modal sounds, these modal chord progressions, this overall key type of thing, it can all be done using just this handful of chords here and just this small little area of the guitar. So listen to these 6 demos back to back and see if you can hear the difference between Ionian versus Aeolian. I mean, those are obvious, but then see if you can hear the difference in Dorian versus Aeolian or Lydian versus Ionian. So I really want to just kind of see if you can just hear, be like, oh, okay, Lydian sounds extra bright, or Dorian sounds minor-ish, but not quite as sad as Aeolian, or Phrygian sounds really dark, even darker than Aeolian. So every mode has its own sound. Every mode is dependent on which one of these 6 chords I dictate to be my tonal center. right, so those are going to be the three perspectives on modes that you're going to find coming up time and time again in this great modes debate. So just as a review, the first perspective is that modes are patterns on the fretboard, which I don't believe to be true because it doesn't matter what order you play the notes in. If you're soloing over something, you can play the notes in any order. You don't have to start on any specific note. Therefore, to say that a specific spot on the fretboard is a mode, that just doesn't make sense. The second perspective is that modes are something that you do on a per chord basis. Play this mode over this chord, play this mode over this chord, play this mode over this chord. Well, why don't you just call them scales? All right, you can call it the Dorian scale, you can call it the Lydian scale. If you're going to play this scale over this chord, this scale over this chord, but once it's called Dorian, it's called a mode all of a sudden. Why do you call it a mode? Just call it a scale. Why the confusion? All right, so you can still switch scales over chords, but don't call them modes, otherwise you're going to confuse everyone. My opinion. All right, and then the third perspective is modes. What they actually are is dictated by the chord progression. You have major keys, which is Ionian sound. You have Aeolian sound, which is minor keys. But then you have Dorian sound, and you have Mixolydian sound, and stuff like that. That's the one I subscribe to. That's the one that makes most sense to me. I'm never going to win this argument. I'm never going to end the modes debate. The best I can do is just make YouTube videos letting people know my perspective. And maybe I'm right. Maybe I'm wrong. Who knows? I don't know. But it makes sense to me. So maybe you guys agree. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Later.